Hi and welcome back to ScottiesTech.Info. I'm Scotty with my co-host Cletus. And when you hear the term cyber war or cyber warfare, what you'll probably think of is like a bunch of nerdy, geeky hacker types sitting in some dimly lit room, their faces gently illuminated by the glow of their computer screens. You might also think of the movie Hackers, or say Ving Rhames in the Mission Impossible movie, where he's sitting at his laptop and they show the screen of his laptop computer, and it's not running Windows or Linux, it's running some special hacker type of operating system, and he's trying to jam the enemy's communications, right? So he types send jamming signal, enter, and the magic happens, right? Yeah, that's not at all how hacking and cyber war actually work. That's the Hollywoodized version. So what I want to talk about today is a particular book. Now, I've talked about like the book Surveillance Valley, and a viewer actually recommended this book to me. It's called Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War, and it's written by a guy named Fred Kaplan. Kaplan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He's written other books, blah, 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 you know. So I got the book and I read it, and as the title suggests, it's about the secret history of cyber war. Now, he actually starts off, the book starts he's talking about in 1983, you know, Ronald Reagan was president of the US and blah, blah, blah. They got, you know, watched the movie War Games and became interested in, you know, is there a risk of, you know, computer hacking, and are our military systems vulnerable to like this type of hack attack, script kiddies, foreign governments, whatever. And the whole rest of the book goes through the entire history, like over 50 years, of what actually happened behind the scenes. And it's a pretty interesting book because none of it actually works the way that we think it does. It certainly doesn't work the way that it does in Hollywood movies. So to give kind of an abbreviated version of the sorts of things that he talks about, back in the early days of the internet, everything was being switched over to digital, essentially packet switch networks. Nowadays, even things like phone calls, like if you have a 3G cell phone, it actually sends audio over the radio waves, more or less. If you have a 4G or higher cell phone, it's using the packet switch network even for voice, which means when you speak into the phone, it's digitizing it, turning your voice, your analog, the analog waveform created by the sound from your mouth hitting the microphone, converts that into a bunch of ones and zeros and sends it in packets, in chunks of data, up over the cellular network and around the world. So as the internet kind of came into being, all that stuff was this digital packet switch network, you know, that was becoming sort of the norm. And so as this whole digital packet switch network thing, i.e. what is now known as the internet and fiber optic connections and the whole our digital infrastructure, if you will, as all that came into being, apparently behind the scenes what was happening is the NSA was sort of sitting on their hands doing nothing, because they were still intercepting, you know, analog conversations over phone lines. They had giant like satellite dishes, and they were intercepting satellite transmissions. And meanwhile, the rest of the world was, and also the U.S., they were all moving over to digital systems. But the intelligence agencies were kind of sitting on their hands, going, no, we don't need to do anything. We don't need to do anything. Which is in stark contrast to today, what we've heard, you know, since in the past several decades, all the sort of revelations about, you know, the NSA spying and all this kind of stuff, you know, and Ed Snowden coming out and all that kind of stuff. But back in the early days, basically no one was really doing anything about it. And so there were a bunch of people who, you know, sometimes generals, sometimes civilians in government or whatever, they would raise the alarm and they would say, Jesus, you know, this whole hacking thing, it's a real threat. Our systems are not secure. So shouldn't we do something about this? And invariably what happened is, you know, they would go talk to, like, you know, 2- and 3-star generals in the military, to talk to, you know, civilian government officials, whatever. And everybody kind of said, yeah, that's really scary, but now we're not going to do anything about it. Now, you also have to understand that there were intelligence agencies like the NSA and the CIA, but there were also quite a few military intelligence agencies. Like the Army had its own, eventually they had their own sort of cyber war guys, and the Navy had their own cyber war guys. And in the beginning, it was no one. Then it became like a handful, like, 4 or 5 people. And today, of course, things are very different. But in those early days, everyone was sort of resistant, especially the military. They were resistant to trying to protect their military computer networks for the simple reason that, back in, say, like the 80s, budgets were being cut, and they said, well, no, we need to devote money towards, our bombers and our missiles and our guns and all that kind of stuff. We don't have the money to spend on, doing this whole cyber war thing. And plus, like, all the multi-star generals would say things like, that's not how you win a war, boy. You win it with guns and ammo and blowing people up, So, again and again over the decades, certain events would happen and this whole thing would come up again and people would go, Jesus, we really need to do something about this. And it was only very slowly and reluctantly that government and military and intelligence kind of agreed to, yeah, okay, we'll start to do some stuff. And they did, but it happened very, very slowly. So the point of all that is Kaplan actually kind of shows in the book that, we have this vision of how secure our military and intelligence computer systems are, and the reality for a very long time actually was it's the exact opposite. There's a couple examples he gives in the book, and I'll just share one of them. At one point, some like military computer system was hacked, and of course, at that time, Iran was in the crosshairs. They were the big evil guys, so of course there were all these politicians in government who kind of jumped up and said, Iran did it, it's Iran. And it turned out that it was actually the son of a military dude who was actually part of kind of the budding cyber warfare team. It was this guy's son who had actually hacked a U.S. military computer system. So it was basically an American kid whose father worked to try and secure everything, who had done the hacking and broken into the military computer system. There's another example where there was another hack that occurred and everybody was throwing their hands up and pulling their hair out and running around screaming, and it turned out that it was actually two college kids over in California, Americans who had hacked into the military intelligence type computer systems. And so it was pretty clear again and again that these systems were not secure. At the same time, while all this was going on, they were kind of slowly recognizing the possibilities, let's say, of attacking other countries or defending against other countries. So it's like, well, okay, we could send our aircraft carriers and our bombers and all that kind of stuff over there, but that costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time. So what about a cyber attack? And of course that was, nobody really wanted to do that at first. Eventually what ends up happening is they actually merged the two together, so you'd have kind of a cyber attack where they'd kill a communications link that was key in, country X, and then you'd send in the traditional forces. And of course all of this was very hush-hush. It was all classified and nobody wants to talk about it. I should note that Kaplan, in the afterword of his book, he says that all the information that he has in here, he interviewed a whole bunch of people, from like generals to former government officials to intelligence officials, both current and former. And for every piece of information that he reveals in the book, he claims that he got confirmation from at least 2 different sources. So hopefully that means it's slightly more accurate, but of course one never knows. But in any case, so it appears he's not just making all this whole story up. So fast forwarding to kind of the current day, like we have this long history of, people dragging their feet, they didn't want to get into it. Obviously the computer systems were not very secure. Then you have more recent years, like all the revelations of spying. You have things like even currently, like people are up in arms over Facebook and privacy, for example. There are Senate hearings and, Google is being grilled and all this kind of thing. The interesting thing is that Kaplan doesn't actually talk about that. Like he doesn't talk about the side that I talked about earlier in reference to Yasha Levine's book Surveillance Valley, where, say, Google started off like from the get-go with kind of DARPA being involved, and then of course he claims they've always had sort of this this sort of subgroup that's linked directly with intelligence, and everybody's spying on everyone else, and there's kind of a backdoor for intelligence for hoovering up all kinds of data and that sort of thing. In this book, in Dark Territory, Kaplan doesn't really talk about that side. He's strictly looking at kind of the military intelligence history of how cyber warfare developed. So when you take what Kaplan says in Dark Territory and what Levine says in Surveillance Valley, and you put them together, you get possibly a more complete picture of how it actually worked. So yes, they were maybe dragging their feet, but they realized that due to certain restrictions, well, what if we, check out these Google guys, maybe we could kind of help fund them a little, and they could, we'll scratch their back, they'll scratch ours, and, that gets us some data. But it's not us doing it, it's private industry doing it. And then, of course, they have these little agreements set up and blah, blah, blah. And, of course, fast forward to today, and you get the situation we have where everybody's hoovering up everybody else's data, and it's all just kind of absurd. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the whole idea that, like, we have the most powerful hackers and cyber warfare team in the world, and we can take anybody out, and that's pretty much true. Because there are some other stories he tells where it's pretty obvious that, say, like the power grid infrastructure, water pumping stations, even military computer systems in foreign countries are essentially nowhere near secure in the sense like Hollywood secure. Like, this is super encrypted and you need your thumbprint and you need that. That sort of thing does exist, but the vast majority of the computer systems that are running absolutely everything in our world are not super secure. And they realized very early on that it's essentially impossible to secure them. And the reason for that is because hackers will always go at things laterally. It's like a conversation I had many years ago with a former colleague of mine where he was talking about, well, if you use this type of encryption, you're super safe. Because mathematically, you would need a room full, a warehouse full of supercomputers to mathematically crack that encryption. And my argument was always right, but if you read a little bit about these things, what you realize is that when somebody goes, intelligence, foreign intelligence, whoever, when they try to break encryption, they don't use brute force. They know that mathematically speaking, in order to brute force crack the encryption, it would require warehouses full of supercomputers. So what they do is they dig into the actual encryption algorithm in one way or another, and they come at it laterally. They come at it from the side. They try to find some quirk, some little bit about the math where it's some mathematical detail where when it's running on modern computer processors, there's a little glitch here, and if they introduce this, they flip a little bit here, they don't need to crack mathematically the super duper encryption. They need to think laterally. They need to come at it sideways, kind of like guerrilla warfare. And that's where they focus all their energy, and invariably they do find some little zero-day exploit or some chink in the armor. So they don't need those roomfuls of supercomputers. And then, of course, they don't tell anyone that they found this vulnerability. And this is the kind of thing that happens with pretty much everything. You can have online accounts, and you can have logins and passwords and two-factor authentication. But if the server where that data is stored is not secure, they don't have to try to log into your account 50,000 times. What they have to do is realize, there's this server over here that's storing account information, and it's insecure. It's not encrypted, and there's some flaw in that server's particular software configuration. So we don't have to attack directly. We can hack into that database over there, and boom, we've got everyone's login details. We can log in as anyone. We can sell their data, whatever. So it was realized by pretty much everyone very early on, but not necessarily shared with all of us, that essentially there is no such thing as online security. I've been saying that for years, and this kind of confirms that. So essentially what you have here is you have a whole bunch of countries around the world, and they all have crack hacker teams. And they actually sort of, like, say the Americans will hack into the Iranians' computer systems and sort of monitor what they do. And the Iranians, for example, will hack into American computer systems, and they're monitoring what the Americans are doing. Everyone has their mitts in everyone else's computer systems. So essentially what you have is sort of like a cyber warfare MAD, a cyber war mutually assured destruction. Everyone knows that everyone else is in other people's infrastructure. So when you flip on your computer, you turn on the TV, and you see some news story that's all dramatic about, you know, such and such a country could shut down our electric grid and they're hacking us and blah, blah, blah. Everyone does that to everyone. But the reason that no one actually uses it is because they know that if we shut down their electric grid, they're going to shut down our electric grid, or they're going to shut down our water purification, or they're going to screw up our, you know, transit systems. So it's kind of like a nuclear standoff where, because this sort of online security is not so good, and because there really is no good way to fix it. For example, he talks in the book, they realized very early on that to fully monitor all the traffic and fully secure everything is just simply literally not possible, because it's just all too dang complex. So they realized that, okay, well, we'll just kind of use offensive capabilities and we'll monitor what everyone else is doing, and that's of course what everyone else did. So here you have this situation where no one really wants to make the first move because everyone could shut down everyone else's countries at the touch of a button. Of course, I'm sure it gets a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it, and that's sort of what he's saying in the book, more or less. That's kind of the conclusion that you can draw from it, is this kind of cyber mutually assured destruction, and so no one wants to actually use it. Yeah, it's actually a fascinating subject, and especially if you've read Surveillance Valley, I highly recommend reading Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War by Fred Kaplan. It is actually a sort of a perfect addition to the information in Surveillance Valley, and as I said earlier, when you put the two together, you get a much better idea, I think, of kind of the big picture, and you realize that it's not just, you know, whatever the media is telling you. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on in the background, and it is a very complicated situation. So yeah, it's quite an interesting read, so check it out if you want to know more. For more techie tips, see ScottiesTech.Info. Thanks for watching. See you next time.